We have to become much more candid with each other about things like migration and say, look, the old debate around morals and ethics and empathy and compassion and redemption from the sins of colonialism no longer works. People have gone fatigued about it. We now have to have more structured strategic engagements around win-win coalitions. Countries in Europe, countries in Africa that come together and say, look, we've got these issues. How do we make them win-win? Today, we are talking about health security for the most part in our dialogue this afternoon. And there are huge, huge issues. When we think of pharmaceutical industry in Africa, we talk about Africa producing 30% of its own medicines, and we say, well, it's not enough. And it's actually worse when you consider the active ingredients and the excipients. Because what happens is that most of the minerals that most of the medicines that we produce in Africa is essentially 95% APIs from China and India, mostly India, and 95% even more of the excipients coming from China and India. And that's because we focus on the health outcome medicines, right? It's easy for you to focus on it. And but when you think of the chemistry that leads to that point, all the supply chain elements, it's not easy for policy to come into the picture because we're very political. Oh, we can't have 70% of our medicines produced overseas or 95% of our vaccines. But then you forget the entire value chain of chemicals, most of which has nothing to do with health per se. So it creates conditions in which a lot of our conversations are focused on political sound bites and not enough of the heavy lifting on the policy side that gets us to really solve problems that are fundamental. And that's been the nature of our European African conversations. There are areas, as you know, in the pharma space, in the diagnostic space, where we don't talk enough about the fact that forget about the finished products, forget about the things that are politically salient, like medicines. We don't do our own diagnostics either. We don't do our own machine servicing for CT scans. There's just hundreds of other health value chain issues where Africa simply is way behind. If you then over-focus on medicines, you create an indicator that in essence is politically salient, everybody can connect to it, but it forgets everything else that's going on, which is that 95% of the value in the ecosystem is not being localized. So it's not just making medicines, it's also making sure that your X-ray machine, when it's down, you have local technicians who can fix it. But if you don't think of it in that elaborate sense, and then you fixate on politically salient data points, politically salient data points like what percentage of vaccines you produce in your country, you can get people over-optimizing for a particular indicator, for particular outputs, particular targets. So when you over-optimize for a particular target, you make sort of silly mistakes, but nobody notices that because they're just watching one target. So how do you do multi-criteria optimization as a continent? How do we look at the whole picture and say, where does Europe play? We know Europe, for instance, has a lot of anxiety about its role in artificial intelligence. True. But then you look closely and you realize that actually all the chips in the world that are driving the artificial intelligence boom will not be produced if it wasn't for one Dutch firm called ASML that is the world's leader in extreme ultraviolet lithography. So the Netherlands is at the heart of the global IT revolution and the global AI revolution. So even though we think of Europe as highly backward in AI and there's a lot of anxiety, Europe falling behind, the truth is when you look at the overall picture, Europe actually is shining in certain areas. That's exactly the same kind of lens that we need to apply to Africa, to look at it in the sense of what is going on symbiotically. And then you say, okay, it turns out that actually there are huge symbiotic relationships in these domains with Europe that we've never thought about. Because we always thought about it in terms of, how do we get Bayer and Glasgow and the rest to open end product outlets in Africa? And I think that distorts the picture. There's so many smaller European companies that do so many other things in the value chains, and they could be in Africa doing great work if we had a more systemic approach to the way we present the relationship and its opportunities.